Hi everyone, it's your book coach Liisa Kovala here. Grab a cup of coffee and settle in for a discussion about all things writerly. I'm the author of Sister's Winter War and Surviving Studhof, my father's memories behind the death cave, and I'm an author accelerator, certified fiction, and memoir book coach. As a Finnish Canadian, I also love my coffee. In this podcast, we'll take a coffee break together to chat with authors, publishers, book coaches, marketers, agents, publicists, booksellers, and many others. Welcome to Women Writing. So happy you could join us for a coffee and a chat. In this week's episode, I'm having a coffee break with Suzy Vadori. Suzy is a book coach, editor, public speaker, and the Calgary bestselling author of the Fountain series. She is a program manager for Calgary's When Words Collide, teaches writing at Alexandra Writers Centre Society, and is a touring member of the Young Alberta Book Society. Suzy loves working with writers at all stages in many genres. She's an advanced certified book coach from Jenny Nash's Author Accelerator. Hi, Suzy. How are you?
I am excellent, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me today.
It's my pleasure. So, what are you taking a coffee break from today?
What am I taking a coffee? Well, I'm recording some of my own podcast episodes, to be honest. But yeah, what am I taking a coffee break from? It's a Monday when we're recording this. I don't know when it's going to air. But typically Mondays are an editing day for me.
Okay.
Editing.
Yeah.
Editing other client manuscripts.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's nice to just take a pause, have a conversation. Coffee or tea? What's your preference? Coffee drinker,
I
tea
drink
drinker?
both. This is coffee, but I'm a decaf drinker.
Oh,
So
why? No, just
dirty water. Well, actually, it's a medical reason. So
okay, fair.
it's not for lack of want. But it's been almost 25 years now, since I've
Wow.
had caffeine. When I was working corporate, I once had an employee. I had a large team, and she found out that I didn't drink caffeine, and she goes, "Well, that's good because you on caffeine would be unbearable." And then she went and gasped and like covered her mouth, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I just said that to my boss," and I laughed, and I was like, "That's
That's so funny.
bang on.
I love it. Oh,
Don't
no,
need caffeine.
I know
Fun
I'm
on
totally
life, right?"
caffeinated until evening when I switched to decaf, but my mother-in-law is strictly decaf, so we always tease her like, "What's the point?" But of course, because it's nice. That's why, because we like it that way. It's all
Exactly,
good.
because well, it wasn't my choice. I had to give up
Yeah.
coffee and chocolate in the same day, but they were gonna
Chocolate?
try. They were not sure what was causing my issues, and so they were gonna try alcohol next, and that was a nonsense. I need
You
my
have
wine,
there, yes, okay, there's limits.
so
There's
that's okay.
coffee can go.
There's limits.
That's fair. Oh, I love it. So you are the host of the Show Don't Tell podcast, and you've been doing this. So I'm the newbie, and you've been doing this for quite a long time. What brought you to start a podcast?
Well, actually, the podcast is pretty new, to be honest. The podcast has only been out for less than a year. But I mean, I've been talking about show don't tell writing forever. It's my passion topic. I'm actually writing a book on it right now, a craft book. I could geek out about it all day long.
Love it.
But you're right. I've done things over the years. I've resisted really hard doing a regular podcast. I was worried about it. I have a newsletter that's been going for about 6 years now, consistently every week. And I had a YouTube channel at one point, and then I abandoned that. And now this podcast, it just felt like it was time.
Mm,
It just felt like it was time to have a conversation with writers about this. I just have so much to say on the topic. Show Don't
yeah.
Tell is one of those things that we think is like tired old writing advice and like mother's milk or whatever. And all
Yeah.
writers say, yeah, 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 I know what you mean. Let
Do
me tell
they?
you that, yeah, do they? It's really two things. It's a really hard concept with so many layers. And even when I bring writers on the podcast, sometimes they tell me what their understanding is, and I'm like, what? That's not what
Yeah,
I
that
talk.
makes
There's so many layers to it, or I
yeah.
learn something from them.
Hmm.
There's so many layers to it, and it's going to be something that writers work on through their whole career, whether they call it
Yeah.
something else or not. It's like
Yeah.
that idea of how do we make reading come alive in readers' brains.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I'm like fascinated by brain chemistry.
Yeah. Yeah. I love Lisa Cron's work on how
Yeah.
writing accesses our brain and how our brain responds to language and
How
words
we're
and
hardwired to
story.
accept story, all of
Yeah,
that. Lisa
all of
Cron,
that is,
Idol.
yeah,
Yeah.
mind blowing. It's really changed the way I think about stories. Yeah, amazing.
Mm.
So if you were to give us a definition, not to put you on the spot but if you were to give
Well,
us like a
I
simple
don't mind.
definition, what might be a definition for show don't tell? Because I think you're right. People don't really have a way of articulating it. Do you have a sort of a succinct way, or is there
Yeah,
a,
I mean
a
it
go-to?
means so much more than you think, right? So the definition that's sort of out there is just showing people how it is instead of telling them, which isn't very, it's so meta, it's not very
Yeah.
helpful,
Mm,
right? I would say that, truly to show don't tell is not giving people the answers, right? It's
mm,
showing them what happens and making them take that one step further. So, for example, one of the really basic things that everybody hears about when they first hear about show don't tell, it's sort of where most people stop, is not naming emotions, right?
mm,
So not naming emotions. So instead of saying she was happy, show me that she had a wide smile on her face.
mm,
Okay, that's basic writing knowledge, and you've probably heard that before. But what I want you to do is dig one level deeper. Why? Why does that work and why is it important? It's not just a rule that somebody said. The reason is because if you were to give me a fact, right? She was happy. Then I go, cool, and I skip past it. If you
mm,
say she had a wide smile on her face, my brain has to light up, go one step further, and decide that she's happy. Guess what that does?
mm.
It keeps your reader awake,
Right.
right? And so it keeps them engaged. And so when you talk about, I teach this all the time to adults and students in schools. I do a lot of school touring. Um, I ask in a wide audience in a gymnasium or something, hey, does anybody here love reading textbooks? I gotta tell you, there's always a handful, there's always a few. Yeah, I love reading
Yeah,
textbooks.
of course.
But it's the difference between reading a textbook, which might be a bullet list of facts that you're trying to memorize, and actually creating story or meaning around it
Mm,
and having your brain light up and
mm,
having us experience it. And so what happens is, people say smiling makes you happy, right? Like literally
yeah,
the act of smiling makes your brain engage in happiness. And so the
yeah.
same thing with showing us in writing is it actually draws us, it drags us inside the pages of a book and
Hmm.
puts us there. And
Yeah.
if you can do that through a ton of techniques, yes, naming emotions is one of like 7 major techniques that I talk
Mm,
about, but it's one. But if you can do that and have us experience it, guess what? We're way more engaged. We're
mm.
feeling it ourselves, right?
Yeah,
Who
love that.
doesn't want your readers to be like cheering for your characters
Mm,
or crying? Have you ever
yes.
cried when you read a book? I know I have.
Yeah, of course. Of
Yeah,
course.
you can't do that without using these
Yeah.
techniques
Yeah, I love
to
that.
your reader.
I like how you describe that. I've sometimes heard and have had somebody say um, that we shouldn't say show, don't tell. We should say show and tell. Because to be honest, we do some telling. It's that the problem is we tend to, especially in early drafts, overtell, right?
Yeah.
So where's that line between, showing and having the reader experiencing it and we're right there with the character versus those little narrative lines where it's informational and it's a quicker way to get the information across, but we're not staying there.
Yeah,
What's your
absolutely.
advice?
And there's definitely a balance. And you talked about first drafts. First drafts are full of telling. They're
Oh,
supposed to be. Don't even try. Like people send me things, writers that I work with sometimes will send me something going like, I'm sorry, I know it's telling. And I'm like, that's
yeah.
fine. There's no
Start
slap on the
somewhere.
wrist,
Mm,
right? You got to start somewhere because drafts are telling yourself the story for the first time. And so
yeah.
you really can't do that experiential thing.
Mm,
So, but there is a balance. And when writers are first starting out, typically, almost almost always. I don't think I've ever seen it the opposite. They tell way too much and they show way too little.
Mm,
Once we've worked together for quite some time and they get experience in this, yes, I see the opposite, where it's like, oh my gosh, you've blown out this entire conversation and it's boring because nobody cares,
right,
right? So
right.
they're doing showing correctly, but
Yeah.
really all they needed to say was, hey, he told her about the fight, right?
Right, right.
We don't need to rehear it, especially if we've already witnessed it. But yeah, there's definitely a balance. So what I would say is this, there's no formula to it, but when you are looking at your scenes, decide, number one, what is your character's goal in the
Yeah.
scene or yourself
Mm,
if it's a memoir, right?
mm,
What are you trying to accomplish? Where's your agency? What are you trying to
yeah.
do in the scene, right? Those things are important.
Mm,
If it's just filler, tell it. Tell
yeah.
it if it's not important, right?
Right.
One of the ways to decide, I mean, there's so many concepts we just talk about here, and they're all intertwined, right? I like to call there's something called theme in a book. I don't use that term, I use the takeaway. So again, we're focused on the
Nice.
reader. What is it that you want the reader to take away from your scene or from the book?
Mm,
And if you look at that, then you can decide which pieces in the scene should be blown out and which shouldn't.
that's nice. Yeah. I like that idea. I taught high school for a long time. And we teach about theme every year. And even my students that I had in grade 9, and by the time they got to grade 12, we're still struggling with that concept of theme. And just the word alone, kind of like the word essay, puts us into a little bit of a tizzy. Like it seems more important and bigger than it actually is. Like just relax, it's fine. But that idea of theme just what I often got was I remember one year teaching Field of Dreams. I don't know, it was a movie with
Mm.
Kevin Costner later. And so what was the theme of the novel? And the students said, oh, baseball. No, no, it's not
Right.
baseball. What
Um,
have I taught you? Nothing. So then we went back.
right.
Let's revisit theme. But I
Theme
like
is
the idea
so
of
difficult.
takeaway. Yeah.
Yeah, so flip it, right? So
Yeah.
it is kind of, and theme is one of those things that's hilarious because not that high school English doesn't get it right,
We try.
but sometimes we're looking for something and the author's like, what? I didn't
Yes.
mean that. And people are interpreting it in 100 different ways.
Yes.
If you do it intentionally, whether or not people get it right doesn't matter. What
Mm,
your takeaway actually does for your entire book is if you have this sort of collection of scenes or collection of ideas, you could test it,
hmm.
right? So you could say, well, I want to have this scene where they go out in the cornfield and talk to aliens.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, does that have to do anything with baseball as the theme? No, just
Yeah.
joking. It's not baseball. But the theme, yeah, of that might be if you build it, they would come, might be a big one, or I haven't really
Yeah.
analyzed it, or do you know what the theme is?
Oh, it's been so long. Put me on this spot. Well, we
Yeah,
should
I don't know. Well,
we'll
okay, well,
edit this in later. Listener, we'll
let's
edit it
say
in later. Give
let's
us your
say it's
comments below.
let's say it's if you build it, they will come, right?
Yes.
So if you prepare for something, it will
Yes.
happen,
Yeah.
right? Could be that takeaway. That might be something that nobody ever hears except the writer, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it's not about, what the reader will interpret later
Yeah.
necessarily.
Mm,
It's helping you also
yeah.
decide, does that alien scene belong in the book?
Yeah.
Probably not,
Yeah.
right?
Another
Unless,
book.
well, I guess if you build unless you build a baseball stadium and then the aliens come and that's what you wanted. I
Yes.
don't know.
100%.
But yeah,
That's
like
your
it's a
next
little
book.
bit. Yeah, that's the next. Anybody take that idea and
Take
run
that
with it.
idea and run with it.
If you write that book, let me know. I'd love to read it. But yeah, it's just one of those things where if you have a direction, it's like you point the gun before you fire, right?
Yeah.
Like where are you
Yeah.
headed? And everything that you include in your book, every scene,
Yeah.
every action, every thought should be pointing in that same direction.
Yeah.
And
Love that.
if it isn't, it's for your next book. Take
Yeah.
it out. Don't think of it as like you can't
Yeah.
use it. Use it somewhere else because even in a series, you're going to have different takeaways for each book,
Yeah.
right? You're going to have, you might not. I mean, Harry Potter, Love Conquers All is the theme for or the takeaway, the point of the book,
Right.
as Author Accelerator calls it. All these different things are kind of related, but I like to
Yeah.
flip it for your
Yeah.
reader.
I really like that. And that's the thing. Like if you Like if you think about when you're working on a book and if you have that idea right from the beginning and everything is kind of moving in that direction, and that's your sort of touch star or your North Star or whatever. Um, the other place that you're going to need it is at the end when you're pitching and when you're telling agents or publishers about it or writing about that. You need that line. You need to be able to tell them succinctly what it is. And sometimes we write the whole book and then we're like, well, what is that like? What is that little elevator pitch? I don't really know. So if you know from the beginning, that's going to be a stronger manuscript, but then it's also you're ready for those next stages, right? And those are the
Yeah.
lines that we tell, like when people ask us, what's your book about? I mean, we hate that question because we don't know how to answer in a succinct way, but if we know what that takeaway is, that makes it so much easier to be able to convey really the heart of the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you can tell people that, I mean, especially people in the publishing industry, but I like to say that they're going to like, if you do this well
Yeah.
and you have everything pointing in the same direction and everything feels cohesive, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a way, those coincidences that happen in books that you're like, that doesn't happen in real,
Yes.
they feel amazing to your reader. Those coincidences or those zoom in moments. It's not, we're not showing every moment of time. We'll talk about that in show don't tell in a second, but yeah, if you can make sure that everything is pointed in the same direction, it feels so
Mm-hmm.
much more cohesive to your reader. They're going to like it better even if they don't know why.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
even I find it fascinating when I work with agents and publishers, sometimes they don't even know what a writer has done. They're like, what is this? Why is it so good? Like they don't know what it
Mm-hmm.
is. And one of those things is making sure that your takeaway is strong enough and that everything, that people aren't just sipping tea,
Yeah.
but what they're doing mirrors in that scene while they're talking, mirrors or contrasts or kind of pushes the character
Yeah.
forward. Like
I love
everything
that.
matters.
Yeah,
I can't tell
absolutely.
you how many times I've seen a science fiction novel where they're eating spaghetti or something that has nothing to do with anything, right? Unless the spaghetti's floating, but I've never seen that. Um, yeah, nothing to do with anything other than
Yeah.
maybe the writer was eating spaghetti that night. Like be
Yeah.
conscious of those choices.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what show don't tell does as
Yeah.
well. Even if the
Yeah.
reader doesn't know why, they are emotionally impacted
Yeah.
by your writing because you
Yeah.
have put them there.
Yeah, real intentionality around it, and including
Yeah.
things because they're purposeful, not just because you're setting the scene.
Not just
You
because you want to get to 70,000 words, right?
right? Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. This will totally up my word count. You said there were seven different techniques or
Yeah.
ideas around that. Can you share some other key
Yeah,
ones
so
that
we
we should
talked
know
about
about?
naming emotions, and if you aren't
Yeah.
familiar with that, check out the Emotion Thesaurus,
Mm,
Angela Ackerman and Becca
yeah.
Puglisi, because it is an amazing resource. It
Yeah.
is not cheating, so take a look.
Yeah. It's
You know
great.
what? One of the coolest things that happens when I use the Emotion Thesaurus is sometimes I realize I got it wrong. And by
Mm,
that I mean not that, my action isn't in the book. The book is basically
yeah.
you can look up an emotion like anger or sadness and see what those bodily reactions might be, both
Yeah.
externally and internally, and what it might feel like. And there's a whole list, like 10
Yeah.
pages of things to
Yeah.
choose from. So you can riff on that. But one of the
Yeah.
things that's cool is sometimes I think that I'm looking up anger, and then I look at everything and none of it works. None of the 10 pages makes any sense for anger. And I realized what I really meant was they were they were feeling challenged or they were
Yeah.
feeling embarrassed and they weren't
Yes.
actually angry. And then so you can kind of hone
That's so
in.
good.
And when we name emotions, we can be lazy about it, right? And we just
Yes.
say, she was this, and it's
Yeah.
not correct. And when you
Yes.
really dig in and spend a moment, you realize that wasn't even right.
Yeah. I
That wasn't
love
what you meant.
that. What I'm hearing too is when you have facial reactions or movements or actions that express an emotion, that's great, but the reader can misinterpret that. So if you have the emotion connected to it, the correct emotion, the one that you're really trying to convey, that interiority from the character. So what they say versus how they behave or how they look or whatever, first and then their interiority or that emotion. Now the reader gets it because you can say somebody, did this or did that, and you're going to think one thing, oh, that person's really upset, and I'm going to think, oh, they're really angry. And it's not like, what did the author intend? Well, that, like you say, having that emotion there will help us, like, guide us to the right what the character's
Absolutely.
really feeling and
So
thinking.
this is a great case of show and tell, right?
Mm,
Especially if it's not clear, then naming the emotion and also showing us what it
yes.
feels like
Yes.
inside their body
Yeah.
can really work, right? Do
Yeah.
both. Do both in
Yeah.
some cases
Yeah.
if it's not obvious, like if it's
Yeah.
open to
Yes.
interpretation. So
Yeah.
I'll start on the seven. I'll start with some of the basic ones that you've probably heard before, and
Yeah.
I'll talk about why they're important
Okay,
because I
great.
think we follow these rules blindly. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things that are talked about a lot less,
Okay.
and that I consider part of show, don't tell, or show and tell,
Mm.
but aren't really very typical. And you probably never heard them talked about that
Ooh,
well. So
I
the
love
second
this.
one, yeah, you love this. You're like taking
Already, you
notes.
know I'm geeking out on
Lisa's
this right
taking
now.
notes. I know I could geek out about show don't tell all day
That's
long. So when
awesome.
somebody's like, "Hey, want to come on my podcast and talk about that?" I'm like, "How many hours may
Yes.
I have, please?"
All the
Yeah,
time.
how many hours may I have? All right. So using ly adverbs, and I think we've talked about this. Like people have heard that before. So
Yeah.
simply, actually, slowly, they are almost always telling. So these
Hmm.
are ways to find it in your own writing. So I'm going to sort of flip it again, right? And be like, okay, I'm the reader. How would I know when I'm doing this? How would I know when it probably isn't going to work for your reader?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So these are things that you can search for in your own writing. Look for those ly adverbs because you're almost always telling.
Hmm.
Hunt them down and replace them with an action instead. Okay, replace
Hmm.
them with something else because it's going to make your writing stronger. Again, we're spoon feeding something to your reader. We're telling them exactly what we think. We're interpreting it for them. Your reader would rather see what happens and make that interpretation themselves.
Mm.
It keeps their brain awake, it keeps them engaged. It's a
Hmm.
weird thing,
Yeah.
right? It's a
Love
weird thing.
that.
Number three, info dumping.
Oh,
We've heard this one before. Info
yeah.
dumping. Info dumping is when we put stuff in these huge long paragraphs. You could see it pretty fast if you're looking in your own manuscript. You could see it because you have these dense blocks with very little white space. It's like a paragraph that's longer than 5 lines. I could probably tell you there's an info dump in there somewhere,
Yeah.
right? And it is not enough. You cannot fix it with dialogue, please, writers. You cannot just put that explanation. Lisa's laughing. You can't just put it inside
Yeah.
quotation marks and say, well, they're telling each other
Right?
that
It's dialogue.
information, right? That does not work. That does not make it not telling.
Hmm.
Again, what the problem is like you're expecting them to be in textbook mode where, if I was to hold out my arms and somebody gives me a fact, I might be able to hold it. They give me another fact, it gets a little bit heavier, another fact, another fact, another fact. I'm going to drop it and give up,
Yeah.
right? Can't process it that way. We need story, we need engagement. I need
Yeah.
to feel something in my own body as I'm reading.
Yeah.
This is actually what sets reading apart from watching a movie,
Yeah.
from all of these other things. Now, in a movie, we've got color and light and special effects and sound and all these other things. In writing, we have showing. We have
Yes.
showing to create that. And if
Yeah.
you don't do it, your writing is boring, right?
Yeah.
So info dumping is simply too much information shared at once. So number one, I invite you, if you find those scenes where, especially in dialogue, like if you've got more than 5 lines of dialogue, please, like,
Yeah. See
please
what's
fix
happening
it.
there.
Because nobody can process that, right?
Mm.
I've seen pages and pages, a character giving a speech.
Right.
Please don't put the whole speech in there.
Yeah.
You can do better. You've got to create this sort of balance, right? And I could talk about that too, but you've got to create this balance. If you've got nothing but dialogue or nothing but prose,
Yeah.
and you don't have a mix of all 5 elements, which by the way, I would say are setting, or inner thoughts, dialogue, actions and reactions, 5 things. If you've got one thing or 2 things on a page and you don't have at least 3, you're out of balance. Your reader's
Yeah.
going to get bored. Their brain's going to get tired. So we want their brain to stay awake and we want their brain to be able to process. So info dumping, if you find a section like this, number one, I challenge you. Do we need it?
Mm.
Does your reader need this? You may need it. It
Yeah.
might be backstory or something really cool that you made up. Um, does your reader care?
Yeah.
Is it going to help them interpret what is going to happen in the story? Is it going to contribute to does it contribute to your takeaway? What you
Yeah.
want them to take away? If it doesn't, just cut it and don't look back. Maybe it's for another book. Maybe you just needed it to make your writing feel real. You needed that background information, but your reader doesn't need it, just cut it. If you do need it, get creative. Break it up. Put a little bit here, a little bit there. Break it up into snippets in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Find a creative way to interact with that information, especially if we're explaining something. Can you drop us into a flashback or drop us into a scene where
Yeah.
you're there in the moment? Can we
Yeah.
experience that firsthand? I don't want to hear about it after the fact,
Yeah.
right? I don't want to hear like about the banana, the guy go, did you see that, Liisa? I saw this guy this morning. He was like the banana peel and he's way up in the air. And oh, huh.
Yeah.
And Lisa's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I
Yeah.
guess you had to be there, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
no different in writing,
Yeah.
right? If
It's true.
somebody's sitting around talking, we might have a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's
Number
I
four.
sorry, I
Yeah,
was
go
going to just
ahead.
say that one of the things I'm finding in early manuscripts, especially for info dumping, is somebody just has a real background in a certain topic. Like they
Mm,
really knowledgeable about, I don't know, pianos. Well, when their character who's a pianist sees a piano, now we're going to get all the things about the piano or how to or whatever. And you just pulled us right out of the story for this,
mm,
information that maybe you've done a ton of research. Historical writers do this a lot. I write historical fiction, so I know I do this sometimes. You put a lot of historical information, political situations, unrest, whatever, and then it's really not serving the story. So to go through and look for those blocks and pull them out because it's not advancing anything except that, but it's so interesting to me, the writer. I really like this information.
Yeah,
The
so
readers
dole it
don't
out
care.
a little bit at a time or use
Yeah,
that information. If the pianist is a geek about pianos,
yeah,
have them interact with it, have them say a fact or something, make it part of
yes,
their personality,
yeah,
then maybe. If it's,
yeah. You
you know,
can get it in there in bits, but not in these giant chunks for
yeah,
sure.
everything that you include should be doing double, triple, quadruple duty, right?
Yeah,
And this is what we miss when we're writing first drafts, especially, or if you're writing your first book and you think, well, isn't it good enough? If it doesn't have all of those duties, if you're not also showing us something about your world, about your setting, about your character, about the takeaway, if you're not somehow contributing and it's just stuck there, take it
yeah,
out,
love
please.
it. Yeah,
Right?
great advice.
Yeah. So number four, we're getting into sort of a different territory, which is things that nobody else talks about. And I don't know why, because I love it, but recapping events that happened off screen.
Yes.
Right? So again, we're in that territory where I saw the guy at the banana peel and now I'm telling somebody about it.
Mm-hmm.
So even more than just info dumping, I'm also just not and being lazy as a writer. I haven't created a scene, right? I've
Mm.
got two people sitting at a table or sitting on a bed or standing around talking about something when you could bring me there. Right? You could bring
Yes.
me there or
Yes.
introduce a different character or have it happen right there, right? Like
Yes.
how can you bring us to the moment? So when your books, everybody manifest this for a moment, when your books become a movie, when they do, right? If you have a scene where somebody is sitting around talking about something that isn't happening, you have a problem because nothing is happening on your screen, right?
That's
And the
right.
same thing in your readers' minds is nothing is happening in their minds. They're not creating a scene that's not well rounded. It's two people sitting around talking, and then they have to conjure something else. It's just once removed, it's just not as interesting. Now, interesting fact about readers' brains, only about 50% of readers are that visual where they conjure something in their
Right.
minds. Okay. And there are some people who do it partially, and then there's a very small percentage who don't conjure an image. Like if I was to say apple, they would not see an apple in their minds, but that's a very small percentage. And I've actually worked with two writers over the years that have that type of brain, which is cool. Everybody's brains are different.
Yeah.
And they had to learn this from scratch. These, particularly these two writers separately, reached out to me because they knew that showing was going to be an issue in their writing because they don't have it.
Ah,
But the thing
interesting.
is for 98% of your readers have some level of that. So even if you don't have it,
Mm,
your readers are going to have, need that information. And
yeah.
50% of your readers are going to need a lot of information.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
just leaving it to chance, you're risking having 50% of your readers not be able to experience your writing in a way that is fully the way that their brain wants.
Yeah. It's so
Um,
fascinating the way
mm,
we, uh, gather the world and how we can interpret it and how we can visualize it or not. And that's such sort of newish research that was astounding when I first heard that. Like, it's just amazing. So, have writers, I love that you worked with writers and you have firsthand experience with what that can be like and that they have learned
Yeah.
so much about how to do
Yeah,
it.
and they love, I mean, and it's a conversation that I have with writers pretty early on because if everybody's brain works differently and they're not good or bad or anything
Yeah,
else, but
just different.
we want our writing to be accessible to as many brains as possible.
Yes.
Right. And so some people need more information and some people need less. And some people you can give them all the information that you want and they're never going to conjure it, but they can still love the writing and experience that, right?
Yeah.
From a words perspective, they picture the words,
Hmm.
but they can still really enjoy it. And so, yeah, we gotta write knowing how it's going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, so number five,
Number
this one's
five.
actually really cool. Um, when you are showing many versus one, it is very difficult for a reader's brain to actually picture that. So if I
Hmm.
said I walked into a crowd, right? Your
Yes.
reader likely will picture sort of some gray, faceless crowd and not really understand what that crowd looks like. And so to give us a detail or two saying describe, don't give me 3 pages on how
Right.
this crowd looks, but zero in, zoom in. This is what showing is like your zoom lens. So if you
Mhm.
were a videographer, again, back to the movies, right? This is how we get visual. We talk about a visual medium, and it's showing is like you are zooming in on the bridge and hearing a conversation, right? And telling is like you're zooming back and just sort of seeing a montage of the bridge and the people and all the things
Yeah.
happening. And there might be some music or lighting or something. It works better in movies than it does in books, a montage. But this is one case where zooming in on one or two individuals in a crowd is actually weirdly way more effective than trying
Mm.
to describe the whole crowd,
Okay.
because it can give us a sense. If I say a crowd, I mean, is it a crowd of soldiers? Is it a crowd of children? Is it a crowd of um courtiers in medieval England? Like, I don't know what is it a crowd. And so when you zoom in, if you can show us one person or a woman at the front of the crowd bent down to help her son with a bonnet, like, I don't know, it's not a good example on the fly there, but yeah, if you can show us what one person is doing or what two people are doing and what types of people are in the crowd, that is way more effective. And the other way that showing this many versus one shows up is when you are showing many times. So if you are starting a sentence or a paragraph with oftentimes, she would go
Yes.
fishing, right?
Yeah.
I can't picture all the times she went fishing. Show
Mm-mm.
me one time. What's the
Yeah.
harm? One day she went fishing and the fish got away. I don't know. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, zoom in, show us some good
Hmm.
showing details. I want to see the fish. I want to see the line, not all of it. Show
Right.
me a detail or two. So, what is the balance? The balance is get as specific as you can
Hmm.
in two or three things in a
Yeah.
scene, right? So
Okay.
if you're not sure, I don't want to hear how they spooled the thread spooled the line onto the fishing rod and then they sat there for an hour or all of those things, right? We don't need all of that, but give me one detail that shows me something about what type of fishing rod it is. Is it a stick with a string? Is it
Hmm.
a high tack? I don't know. Give me something.
Yeah.
Give me something that tells me something about your your setting, the world, the
Hmm.
character, all of those things. Are they super meticulous or
Hmm.
are they really lazy about their fishing gear?
Yeah.
Do it, make it interesting,
Yeah.
right? But I can't picture, I mean, it's just a throwaway. If you've got
Right.
many times they would go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's
Love
not going
that.
to work. Um,
That's a good one. I see that all the time. And that's the advice too, is just get us into the story present. Like, what, like, let's see that actually happen instead of repeat, like, oh, this is something that happens regularly. Well, it feels so distant, right? It takes us out of the story. So that's great advice.
yeah. The next one is related as well. Being vague when you could be specific, please don't, right? And it's actually interesting when I'm editing or working with a writer, I usually can put in a comment, you haven't decided this yet.
Okay,
I know
that's fair.
exactly when they haven't decided. So let's say they're writing about magic and they've got something like something came up, right? And like, you haven't decided how your magic works. I could tell. And they're like, how do you know that? It's because when we don't know as a writer,
Mhm.
then we start to use all this really vague and non-specific language. He put all his stuff in a backpack. Well, what
What's
stuff? Is
yeah.
he bringing pots and pans? Is he bringing clothing? Is he bringing survival gear? Like, I don't know
Yeah.
what he's bringing, right? Give me
Mhm.
something specific and zoom in on one or two things or two or three
Yeah.
things, right?
Love that.
Show them to us, because if you don't do that, I'm bored.
Hmm.
And I can tell you that it's
Yeah.
probably that you haven't thought about it.
Yeah.
And you might need to go and do a whole like brainstorming doc that
Yeah.
might be 2 or 3 pages long on how your magic works or what he wanted to bring
Yeah.
with him and why on that trip.
Yeah.
Don't put that in there, right?
Yeah.
Don't write it, but don't put that whole thing in your book. It doesn't count as word count.
Yeah.
Give me 2 or 3 things, right? Give
Yeah.
me
I
two or
love
three
that.
things.
Well, and that
Yeah, that's
idea of
it.
being specific about what goes in the backpack, it's not just about the fact that he has a backpack or is bringing things. It's every choice that he of item that he brings. It tells us something about him or the situation or what he
Yes.
expects out of the situation. So, like you said, having things do double duty. It's not just to fill the backpack. It's that he intentionally chose items for it for whatever survival or going to class because the da da da, like whatever it is. But it tells us something about the person too. So, yeah, I totally know what you mean when it's vague like that and we're like, what? Like, what's going on? But then when you get specific, it makes so much sense for the reader to understand what the
It does.
situation really is.
And and I mean, the answer is always, especially if there's something in that backpack that we need to be able to anticipate later, right?
Yes.
So a lot of times we think that it's awesome, like, oh, I'm not going to tell you that yet, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost always, as a writer, let me tell you, it's almost always the wrong answer to hide stuff.
Yeah.
Because your reader will notice when you're hiding it.
Yeah.
Give them the information, describe a few things in the backpack. And if one of those things ends up being useful, right, later,
Mhm.
wouldn't it be cool if your reader, whose brain is super smart
Mhm.
and reading ahead, remembers that backpack
Yeah.
thing before you tell them?
Yes.
Them anticipating it makes them feel smart, right? Like, it's okay. You
Absolutely.
don't need to hide that.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree. So
yeah, you
good.
don't need to hide that.
That's awesome.
Okay. And then the last one, I mean, there's many more, and there's going to be many more in the book, but these are some basic ones that you can look for in your own writing. When you are telling me what isn't in a scene, I can't picture it. So, for example, if your character sees nothing, if they open the door and there's nothing in the room,
I was wondering, what do
right?
you mean? Oh, yes, I know what you mean.
Right?
Yes,
Flip
yes.
it, flip it. What do they see? Okay, they
Mhm.
don't see nothing, literally nothing.
Yeah.
What do they see? They see white walls and a floor, and the elephant is not inside. You could tell me that. But rather than just going with the negative, it's almost like, and I've found a good way to say it to writers, but it's almost like when you have a double negative, right? Like
Mhm.
it's really hard for your brain to picture. There
Yeah.
were no books on the shelf, right?
Yeah.
Well, you've missed an opportunity to show your reader a detail or two about what is there. Is there
Mhm.
dust on the shelf?
Mhm.
Is it wooden? Is it metal? I don't know, but a detail or two about what is there is way more interesting to people than what isn't there.
Yeah, I love that. And I specifically love the idea of you as a writer walking into a white room. Because if it's a white, we've all seen, that idea of a room that has nothing, white ceilings, floor, the whole thing. But if you're the reader and you're walking into that a white room, it's so disorientating. Like, where am I? When am I? What's about to happen? What's going? Those key details help us ground ourselves in time and space. And then whatever particular items you're focusing on means that the author is kind of highlighting, again, is telling us something about the situation or the character or the mood or whatever it is. But I love the idea of the white room. That just, as a visual person, really resonates for me. Like,
So
we've got
did
to
you
get
know,
that
and
room painted.
maybe you're doing it on purpose, but
Maybe.
did you know, because there is something called white room syndrome? And so, no,
Oh,
okay. So there is something called white room syndrome, and that is when you haven't provided grounding details. I'll talk about that in a second.
okay.
When you do not provide grounding details, it's sometimes called white wall syndrome, sometimes
Yeah.
white room syndrome. Did you know
Okay.
that the brain's default is actually to picture characters floating in a white room?
Like
If you
actually
don't tell us,
floating.
yeah, because they're not grounded. That's why it's called
Yes.
grounding. So if
Love that.
they're not, yeah, so when you walk in, if you don't give those visual readers in particular, although all
Yes.
people, if you go further and read it, if you don't give them that grounding information, I'll go through what those things are in the first two paragraphs of your scene or
Yeah.
chapter, then you actually run the risk that what they will picture is that. So we think that the brain's default would be like gray or space or nothing. It
Mm.
isn't. It's white. Isn't that
Wow.
weird? It's
That
like
is so
literally a
bizarre.
blank canvas and they're waiting for you to ground them. And
It's
so, yeah,
it's amazing. I can totally picture it as you're describing it, and I hear the echo. Like I hear the echo,
yeah.
and because there's nothing. And that is, I love the idea of the floating too. So those details are going to bring us into that space and be able to see it. And
Yeah. And so
then
there
we can
are
populate the rest of it, right? Like if we get a few details, we
absolutely
can see the
just a
whole thing.
couple of details, not all
Okay.
of it, but a couple of details. And our
Yeah.
brains are smart. There
Mhm.
are readers. So I said that 50% of readers are very like hugely visual and need
Yeah.
that and won't picture it. The other part that aren't people who can't picture it at all, which is a very small percentage, will fill in that information. However, if you have not given us that information about what is in that room in
Yeah.
the first two paragraphs and they fill it in and they find out later that they were wrong, it's very
Oh,
jarring, right?
no, that's not good.
It's
As
very
a
jarring.
reader,
So
you're
the
like, where, what? Where are we now? That's not what I thought.
Yeah, especially, I mean, the one that's very typical is if you've got somebody in the room. So, and you haven't announced it at the beginning, and then all of a sudden somebody's talking, and you're like, wait, what? Where did they come from? Right? I think
Yes.
I'm 100% visual reader, by the way. It makes
Yes.
me, I think, a good editor, but it makes me very anal about this. So,
Yes.
in the first two paragraphs, if you are going to ground people in the scene and you don't want them to have white wall syndrome, you want to tell us the following information. Number one, whose head are we in?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you are, writing third person close or you're writing from a narrator and it's consistent through the entire book, this may not be as important. But if you have multiple points of view, multiple point of view characters, and you are sort of skipping around, right, from head to head to head,
Yeah.
hopefully you're not head hopping within the same scene. If you
Yeah.
are, you might be writing an omniscient. It's not as popular these days,
Yes.
do some reading in your genre and find out like whether or not that's even still done in your genre.
Yeah.
You might find that it's not. And
For
then
sure.
you have to backpedal. So find that out early. But yeah, you want to tell us whose head we're in. So make it obvious, right? Have a thought, an inner thought, or have them interact with something.
Mm,
And it should be obvious.
yeah.
Then who is in the scene so that we're not surprised,
Yeah.
right? Who is in the scene is really important. Where are we in time and space
Mm,
relative to the scene that we just left? And I'm going to talk
yes.
about that in a second.
Love that.
And then setting, a
Mm,
detail or two on setting. And that should
yeah.
be in the first two paragraphs. And if it's
Yeah.
not, you're going to get the white room syndrome or you're going to get
Yes.
another reader who is confused.
Yeah.
So,
So good. I
yeah.
love that.
So the time and space piece, I like to liken it to has anybody ever like tell me this, Lisa, have you ever been looking for your keys and you're late and you're looking has it ever
No,
happened?
of
Never
course.
happened in my life, right? Or your phone now. Nowadays we look
Oh,
for our
yes,
phone. I'm
for
always
sure.
missing my phone. And you're going around your house and then you walk through your bedroom and you're in a hurry and you're trying to find it and
Yeah.
you go, what was I looking for?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that is a
100%.
true and real brain phenomenon.
Okay.
And it is called the doorway effect. And it
Okay.
is when you walk through a door. And the reason is because when you walk through a door, your brain has to process, where am I? And so it says, oh, my bed isn't made yet, and the windows are open,
Yeah.
and I left that glass of water on my bedstand. And it processes that information. And it can't also process, I'm still looking for my keys. And so it takes you a beat because you have to ground yourself in that room. And when you walk through a doorway is
Amazing.
when your brain does that. Did you
Amazing.
know that this is exactly what happens? And you are the God of your story.
Mhm.
This is what happens when we start a new chapter or we start after a scene break. And people will tell me, but Suzy, I just left that last scene. It's like 10 seconds later. I don't care is my answer. I don't care. Yes, I'm still looking for keys. However,
Mm-hmm.
you have just invoked the doorway effect.
Yes.
You have started a new scene, and literally, you can take us anywhere as a
Yes.
writer. You can take us forward in time, you can take us backward in time, you can take us to the moon, you can take us underwater, you can put us in somebody else's head. You have so much power as the writer, and we're waiting. And
Mm-hmm.
guess what happens? If you don't give us that information in the first two paragraphs, what are we going to do?
Yeah, we're
We're
back
going
in
to
that.
skim ahead.
Oh,
We're going to
yes.
skim ahead and we're going to get grounded because it's uncomfortable and we don't know where we are.
Mm,
And we're going to skim ahead and you're going to skip all that wonderful writing that you
yeah.
did at the beginning. You're like, well, I want to say this first because it's amazing. I can tell you your reader's going to miss it. So
Mm-hmm.
don't do it. Just ground us. It takes
It's
10
so good.
seconds.
Yeah.
Check it. Yeah.
Well, and readers are so savvy. Like if there is a page break, it might be the same chapter, but there's a page break. They do expect to be brought somewhere else, so they want to know where they're
Mhm.
going. And so, it's. But I love the idea that your brain just functions that way. It explains a lot about why I leave a room and can't find the thing, or what was I doing here? What was I like? It was so important to me. So thank you for that, because I thought I was losing it a little bit as I'm aging, but it's a
There's
real
that
thing,
also.
folks.
I
It's
mean,
a real thing.
yeah, it's a real thing, and maybe we do more of it, or maybe we've trained ourselves more as we get older to
Yeah.
process that information. But yeah, it's a
Yeah.
real thing. It's called the doorway
Yeah.
effect, and
Amazing.
I believe that it's the identical problem in writing.
Yeah, I think that you're onto something there. This is resonating for me for sure.
Brains are so much fun. I could
It's
talk about
so
brains all
good.
day long.
That's
I think that'll be my
amazing.
next career is as a brain
I
person.
love it. I know. It's so fascinating to me. That was number 7. That one I'm going to have to keep reminding myself of, as long as I don't work on it, don't
There was
forget.
actually a lot of different tangents that we went on there. So yeah, I could
Oh,
talk
no,
about
but
writing
it's
all day long.
so good. You really can. So can we pivot just a little bit, because not
For
only
sure.
are you the host of your podcast and a book coach, you're like the Canadian goat of author accelerator book coaches, because you've been doing it an awfully long time. I think how many years have you been book coaching now? Like you're
I
a
actually
decade
got
almost, eh?
certified in 2020. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, not a, I
Oh,
have
I
been
thought it
book
was closer
coaching.
to,
Yeah,
but
no,
still,
well, I have been coaching and editing almost a decade, yes.
yes.
However, I only met Author Accelerator early 2020 before
Okay.
the pandemic. I became aware of them. And at that
Yeah.
time, I wasn't looking to grow that side of my business, but I
Mhm.
started following Jenny and all the things. And and I was doing a lot of public speaking. So I was making a living as an author, doing conferences and also touring schools. I still do a little bit, not nearly as much as I was
Yeah.
doing in 2018, 2019, 2020,
Mm.
where I was going to schools and making appearances and selling books in person and speaking
Nice.
to audiences specifically of young adults and
Mhm.
also for adults
Mm.
and all of those things. And when the pandemic hit and that all went online, it kind of went
Yeah.
oof, right? I only left my actual day job as an executive in 2018 when I didn't have any vacation days left to
Yeah.
take off to go do all the author stuff that I was
Yeah.
dying to do. And we're like, my husband's like, hey, you can't take our family vacation days and go and work.
Yeah.
So
And
you
so you
can't
said,
do
okay,
that.
I'm gonna not work.
Yeah, and
How'd
then
that
I was
go
like,
over?
something's gotta give, and I'm like, day job gives. He's like, not day job, not day job. I'm like, day job, and I just kind of wheedled them down,
Yes.
and then I was like, well, I'm gonna make it work because I was getting paid to do all of these
Yes.
things, and so cobbling it together. And when the pandemic hit, and all of that sort of disappeared, I was booked out about 6 months in advance for appearances, which was amazing. Like it's so
Yeah.
hard to get that work as a writer and you're constantly pitching and trying to find places to be and to present and to appear and to do all of that stuff is, a job in itself. And I was so proud of where I was at in 2020. And then a lot of it went away and some of it went online, which was
Mm.
really frustrating because the programs that came back online, if I had a day rate, um, do go and travel and do something with a school for a day
Mm.
or at an organization for a
Yeah.
day, then all of a sudden they're like, well, could you come and talk for half an hour? And the fee was much smaller and it was online and
Yeah.
all of these things. And I had to recompete for that business. So I had
Right.
to do proposals again and all these things. And I did.
Yeah.
And I did a lot more things, but I was being paid for less. And I didn't love it. It
Mm.
wasn't
I
like,
feel the same.
I wasn't out there and people are
Yeah.
multitasking and not paying attention or whatever else, or they're getting canceled. The
Yeah.
Zoom meetings were getting canceled because somebody would be quarantined or something. Like
Right.
that's the
Very true.
reality that we're in. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
there was less and less of that work. And I just looked at my whole portfolio and I realized I could lean into what I was already doing, editing and book coaching. And I
Yeah.
remembered, and I'd been following Jenny, and I didn't think that I
Yes.
needed that certification at the time. And then I was like, all right, I got the time, I'm gonna do it. And so yeah, dove in 2020. And then I think I was certified in December 2020.
Amazing.
And then yeah, my book coaching. And one of the real things that I wanted to figure out was number one, I teach concepts that are a little bit out there, right? They're very different from what the mainstream editors are teaching. And the reason I do that is because I find it just resonates more, right?
Hmm.
Like I'm looking
Hmm.
for ways to teach these really complex writing concepts and help writers understand them so that they can hit the ground running and not feel totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So number one, I wanted to sort of join that community and share with them what I'm doing and make sure that it wasn't totally out to left field. And it's
Yes.
not, right? Like it's really cool how it sort of dovetails in with everything else that's happening. But also I wanted to figure out how to scale
Hmm.
and
For
to
sure.
join that community and to meet
Yes.
other people like me. I didn't have a
Yeah.
name for what I was doing. I was calling it
No.
writing coaching.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
book coach is really a term that Jenny has coined, and I
Yes.
appreciate it. It's a really
Yeah.
fun term.
Yeah, it is.
Encompasses a
And
lot.
and we're seeing, well, and with our book coaches Canada now, we have book coaches across Canada are trained by Author Accelerator, and that's a great community. You and I are both a part of that community, and so supportive and encouraging, and just it's not competitive. It's really bolstering each other and helping each other and solving problems and figuring out business. I don't know, whatever finance issues or taxes or all the
Yeah,
stuff that we
exactly.
don't care as much about, but that has to happen, right?
Yeah, and we're all sort of building it our own way and helping writers in our own way. And that's what
Yeah.
I love about it is yes, we have a shared certification, but everybody brings their own spin to it. And
That's
so,
right.
what works for me in a writer, I work with mostly newer writers. Although there's many writers, once they work with me, they come back forever. I work on
Yes.
their fifth books and their 10th books and
Yes.
everything in between.
Nice.
But yeah, I tend to get a lot of newer writers coming from outside of the writing industry and wanting to sort of skip that learning curve and figure out, like, I think in matrices. So my former life, I was an operations professional, and
Okay.
so you couldn't get more different. And if you don't know what an operations professional is, basically, I was the chief operating officer at several different companies in manufacturing and in tech, and ran the company, right? So you got to figure out a lot of different things and you got
Mm-hmm.
to take a huge amount of information and make it
Yeah.
accessible.
Yeah.
And that's what I did when I became a book
Yeah.
coach and when I became a writer is I tried to study with the best editors, the best publishers, the best agents that I could afford to meet, that I could meet in my communities. I made myself go and study with them and take
Mm-hmm.
that massive amount of information and kind of force it back into something that I could help other writers,
Yeah.
right?
I
So
love
that
that.
nobody has to bumble around. Like, let's
Right.
get to it,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Um,
Yeah. You have all that
yeah,
expertise, you have that background, and you have three published young adult novels. Can you tell us a
sure do.
little
Yeah.
about those three
Yeah,
books?
absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm so proud of these books. I mean, they really changed the course of my life. And for those of you who are thinking, who have a different job right now or think that this might just be a hobby, that's what I thought.
Mm.
I thought that I always knew that I would write a book one day. And on maternity leave with my third child, she's 13 now, I sat down and finally wrote that book. Pieces of it which had been in my head for a very long time, but much of it new. And it later turned out to be the book The Fountain. And The Fountain is about 16-year-old Ava, and she moves from San Francisco to New England to find out more about her mom who died when she was 10. But when she gets there, the kids aren't very nice. And all kinds of crazy things happen to poor Ava, and she gets really upset. And she runs into the woods and she finds a mysterious fountain and she
Mm.
throws a coin into the fountain and she wishes that one of the girls that she just met had never existed. And when she
And
returns to the boarding school that she attends, the girl is gone and absolutely everything in her life has changed, even her own family. She has
wow.
to find out about the magic of the school that she goes to and the history of her own family. She meets a boy. It's a romance. Lots of fun.
Mhm.
So that is The Fountain. The Fountain actually was shortlisted for an Aurora Award finalist in 2016 for Best Young
Nice.
Adult Novel.
That's
And
amazing.
actually, there are 3 books in this series, and all 3 were shortlisted for the Auroras. We
That's
haven't won yet.
amazing.
Um,
Oh, that's
but hey,
awesome.
top 5 books in Canada, I will take it
Yes,
every day. And thank you so
100%.
much to everybody who helped make that happen.
Oh, that's
The
amazing.
number one question that I got asked when The Fountain was released was
Yeah.
what was with the girl? She was truly awful. She deserved to get wished away. And so I wrote The Westwoods. It's actually a prequel. The Westwoods, Courtney's the girl in the Westwoods, and she has a really good reason, a magical reason why she was acting that way. And that's what The Westwoods is
Interesting.
about. And then
Okay.
the wrap up of the whole thing is the Wall of Wishes, where Courtney and Ava have to work together. They don't get along, for good reason.
Yeah.
But the Westwoods is about to be destroyed. The school is going to build a road, and the fountain will be destroyed. So the original fountain, where there are wishes going back over 100 years on that fountain, and the girls are worried if the fountain is destroyed, the wishes will all get undone.
Oh,
And
wow.
Ava knows that her dad wished for her mother's love. And so she's quite
Ooh, high
motivated to
stakes.
save the fountain because, yeah, if they never got married, she would no longer exist.
Right.
So she has to work with her nemesis, Courtney.
Love
This
that.
book was so much fun.
I
This book
bet.
was purely for the readers. It ended up being released, that during the pandemic, which was a tough time to release a
Yes.
book.
Hmm.
But it was just, we had to finish the series for the
Yeah,
readers.
that's amazing. Oh, so exciting. So, what are you working on next? A little birdie tells me you are writing some nonfiction for us.
Yes, I am absolutely. I'm always writing fiction, and I have a couple of other novels with my agent currently that haven't sold yet, but hopefully I'll be able to talk about them soon. And I'm writing a nonfiction craft book for all of you writers out there, and it will be on Show Don't Tell Writing. So much of what I've talked about here today, and lots more, lots of examples. What I really want to do is demystify this crazy concept and make sure that you do it right. Because when you get this done, readers may not have any idea what you did. They may not recognize your prowess and your technique, but they're just going to like your story
Yeah,
better.
for sure. Absolutely. Well, we're excited for that. I'm excited for that. And I'm sure other listeners are going to be excited about getting their hands on that book when it's released because like you say, it's one of those concepts we all need to know about and we all struggle a little bit with what does that mean? And you've really helped to explain it today in such concrete ways that we can actually go and apply to our work, which is amazing. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on. It's so fun to take a coffee break with you and talk about all things writing. I also could talk to you all day long because you're so enthusiastic about craft and about show don't tell and about writing and writers. And I feel the same way. I feel like there's so much great energy here, and I just want to thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Yes, and thank you for the work that you do, Lisa. Like getting people's stories out there is the thing that we need to do. We got to get past the worries. We got to get past the craft and just get your story out there in a
Yeah,
way that's going to impact readers. And I
yeah.
know that you do that with readers or with writers as well. And thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you. All right. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Bye.
Do you have writing goals that you want to achieve in 2025? If you need support, encouragement, accountability, and community, join the Women Writing Circle. We meet bi weekly to set writing goals and get pages done. Go to Women Writing on Substack and subscribe. Let's create a little magic this year. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to have a coffee break with us at Women Writing. Don't forget to subscribe to Women Writing on Substack. If you like this episode, share it with someone who needs a writing break and a little inspiration. Happy writing! Thank you to Michael Jensen for his original music and editing, and to Mia Jensen for the logo design.